In this lecture, we'll discuss social cognitive theory, which states that human behavior results from the interplay between the self system and environment, and places a particular emphasis on observational learning. Social cognitive theory was developed by Albert Bandura. It explains how humans learn in a social context and how they regulate their own learning. It was formerly called social learning theory. However, it opposes Skinner's view that cognition is an epiphenomenon, and it integrates behaviorism with cognitive and social learning. By including cognition, it helps explain phenomena operant theory finds difficult. The cognitive perspective can be seen in two aspects of the theory. The first, observational learning, which we'll discuss in detail, and the second, self-regulation, which we'll briefly discuss. One of the most basic assumptions of social cognitive theory is the idea of reciprocal causation, which simply means that people and their environments mutually influence each other. For instance, a person influences the environment, and the environment in turn influences behavior. And that behavior then influences the person. And these relationships happen in all different directions. But the main point is that the person, the environment, and the behavior are continuously interacting to impact each other. So now let's move into this idea of observational learning, which is really the meat of social cognitive theory. Bandura did a study on observational learning called the Bobo Doll Study. And what this study was about is he put an adult in a room with a Bobo doll. This is a inflatable clown. You can hit it, it comes back forward. And the adult would hit the clown, hit it with the hammer. And then they'd put kids in the rooms. Well, the kids were watching the adult. Turns out that the kids who were watching the adult were more likely to be aggressive with the Bobo doll. And in fact, some kids would go above and beyond the aggression of the adult, which led Bandura to recognize that children learn from observing others, which led him to develop his social cognitive theory. A key aspect of observational learning is the idea of modeling. Modeling is demonstrating a behavior for another or imitating an observed behavior. Using models can be a very effective form of education, whether it's adults or whether it's peer-to-peer models. However, there are characteristics that make a good model and can lead to a more effective, successful learning environment. For instance, one of the key aspects of a good model is competence. They must be good at the behavior that they're modeling. Another aspect is prestige and power, and this doesn't mean generally prestigious individual. It could be more related to that specific behavior. They have prestige with that behavior. The next is appropriate behavior. Are they acting appropriate given the task at hand? And finally, is that behavior relevant to the learner's situation? If these four components are present, the model is likely to be more effective. Bandura theorized that in observational learning there were four sub-processes. The first sub-process were attentional. These are factors influencing attention, which could include the attractiveness of the model, previous consequences for imitating models, incentives for attending, such as expected consequences, and perceived expertise. The second sub-process is retention. This is mental coding and storage of observed behavior. There are two types of mental codes: mental images and verbal codes. Factors that influence retention are mental rehearsal, such as maintenance rehearsal, repeating something over and over again, and elaborative rehearsal, relating incoming information to your current knowledge. And a second factor influencing retention is dual coding. You can code things both in visual or images and verbal or words. And when you code things in both of these ways, in image and verbal, you're more likely to retain it. The third sub-process is production. This is converting memory codes into action. Factors influencing the quality of motor reproduction are the learner's physical abilities. Can they actually complete the task? Do they have the ability? And the quality of the symbolic coding. And this can impact attention and retention. The fourth and final sub-process is motivational. And according to social cognitive theory, these are largely a function of consequences. However, in social cognitive theory, the types of consequences go well beyond those in operant theory, and we'll look more at that in the next slide. So now let's take a closer look at how consequences affect motivation. First, they lead to the development of expectations. Expectations serve as incentives to act, which influence willingness to admit the behavior, effort, persistence, directing of attention, and the extent of symbolic encoding. Consequences do not affect learning directly. Bandera posited that there were three types of consequences. Direct consequences, those that occur directly to the learner, which are very similar to operant theory. Vicarious consequences, those that are observed occurring to somebody else. And self-regulated consequences, those controlled by the learner. They are the self-reactions or the self-regulated consequences following our self-evaluation or self-judgment of our performance. And finally, Bandera posited that there are two types of expectations, outcome and efficacy expectations. Outcome expectations are expectations of the likely outcomes or consequences following particular behaviors. Whereas self-efficacy expectations are beliefs in one's capabilities to organize and execute the courses of actions required to produce given attainments. So what are the teaching implications for Bandera's social cognitive theory? First, it's important to enhance student self-efficacy. This will increase learning and motivation. Next, carefully select models to be most effective. Use the components of effective models that were included on the previous slide. And finally, knowing about reciprocal causation and that behavior impacts an individual, which impacts the environment, to increase optimal learning, it's important to design an effective learning environment that has a positive impact on an individual, a student, and their behavior.